Africa was once home to powerful and sophisticated civilizations that rivaled any in the world, long before the arrival of colonial powers. Along the East African coast, the Swahili city-states thrived as centers of trade and culture, connecting Africa with Arabia, India, and even China. To the south, the Zulu Kingdom rose with remarkable military organization and a vibrant social order, while in the west, the Benin Kingdom dazzled with its artistry, bronze works, and carefully structured governance. In the north, ancient Egypt stood as a beacon of science, architecture, and statecraft. Its pyramids and temples are still symbols of human achievement. These civilizations shaped Africa's identity for centuries, but their dominance waned over time, accelerated by the disruptive arrival of European colonialists. In today's show, we rediscover Africa's great civilizations, explore how they rose and flourished, and reflect on how colonialism reshaped the continent. I'm Penina Karibe. Welcome to Talk Africa. And joining me now to unpack Africa's great civilizations are, from Cairo, Dr. Mwanes Hojairi, Assistant Professor of History and International Relations. We have from Lagos, Professor Waziri Adisa, Associate Professor of Sociology at the University of Lagos. From Cape Town, Ben Mwasinga, who's a Senior Manager at Heritage Conservation Management at South African Heritage Resources Agency. And with me here in studio is Dr. Kenneth Obongi. He is an immediate former chair, Department of History and Archaeology at the University of Nairobi. And we also have an audience, students from the University of Nairobi here in studio with us. Welcome to the program and thank you all for joining us. Dr. Obongi, my first question comes to you. When we talk about civilization, what is the definition according to the West versus the meaning of definition in the West, in the African context?
Thank you very much for that question. And I should say that's a question that we have been grappling with as historians. You see, the West defined civilization simply as societies that exhibit the complexity of the art of writing, centralized political system, clear coded laws and regulations, which are very clear acts of power. Now, conversely, in the African setting, civilization is a whole corpus of a complex relationship of harmony between human beings and the environment, relations and kinship between people, and how this relates and works with the ecological setup where they are. So at the center of understanding civilization in an African setting is actually people and human relations. At the center of defining civilization in an overly Eurocentric setting is actually power and hierarchical relationship.
Interesting. Dr. Hojairi, let me come to you. When we talk about ancient African civilizations, ancient Egypt often dominates the conversation. What are the other civilizations that you believe possessed a level of complexity, wealth, or influence that truly thrived and left a valuable legacy to today's societies?
I mean, if we're looking at ancient Egyptian civilization, of course, we have to also put it in a context of a broader African context, going through the Nile Valley, reaching all the way to Aksum, for instance, but also in its Mediterranean context. So, the Eurocentric perception of things would kind of isolate Europe from a global perspective. While if we're looking at, say, ancient Egypt as a civilization, we can't really, and we shouldn't, isolate it from the global context that included both the Indus Valley, for instance, and definitely Mesopotamia, and certainly the rest of the Mediterranean basin. So in many ways, if we're going to look at a context of civilization outside of a Eurocentric perception that meant to create exclusivity, then we have essentially a continuum involving the Nile Valley civilization, the Mesopotamian civilization, and of course Anatolia and the Aegean area as well. So in this regard, we don't want to isolate Egypt and refer to it as a distinct standalone civilization that existed outside of an African context, of a Mediterranean context, and also out of an Asian or Eurasian context.
Well, Ben, let me ask you the next question. The Trans-Saharan trade was the internet of its day. How did the trade in gold, salt, and other goods not only enrich kingdoms like Ghana and Mali, but also foster the exchange of scientific knowledge and architecture, creating centers like Timbuktu, for example, in Mali?
Yes, I think what is often overlooked, again, we do live in a world that has a very Eurocentric view of civilization, but what is often overlooked is that in Southern Africa, there was the Kingdom of Mapungubwe. And this Kingdom of Mapungubwe was one of the first, I'd say, African civilizations, which also had complex, as you've now asked, trade relationships. Their primary trading tools were gold. They also had a very complex social system, and they were also a hierarchical society that had a class structure. They were succeeded then by the Kingdom of Great Zimbabwe, which again was also very much pivotal to transatlantic gold trade. And this was also stretched from what is now known as Zimbabwe, South Africa, all the way to Mozambique. And even the Portuguese at that time, what attracted them to start colonizing that region of Africa was indeed the fact that they were already existing people with existing trade routes that were abundant in gold and other resources.
Professor Adisa, historically, many narratives ignore the genius of indigenous African engineering. Could you highlight an achievement in areas like architecture, maybe water management, or any other field that demonstrates advanced technology independent of external influence?
Okay, if you look at the first writing system emerged in Africa and Egypt, and then this evolved across the continents. There were writings on skins, on mountains, on items that could allow them to recall events and then to connect the events to people, to culture, to science, to technology, to changes in their society. So what Westernization did was to subdue this and make it inferior, and then introduce modern writing systems across the African continent. If you look at the history of Ife for thousands of years before the coming of the colonialists, Benin Kingdoms in Nigeria invested so much in iron and sculpture. But when colonialism came, the main aim of colonialism was to impose imperial capitalism, imperial culture on African indigenous people. And one of the things they did was to destroy existing science and technology in the continent. And for Benin, that was what led to the invasion of Benin Empire. And when they invaded Benin Empire, they stole some of the artifacts and evidences of technological prowess of the kingdom. I want to make reference to Mali specifically, the rise of Mansa Musa to the position of one of the greatest African kings in West African history. Under him, gold was a major commodity for sale, and his empire was able to trade in gold, and this provided him a lot of wealth. So the trade in gold, in salt, and other goods were very significant for the rise of many West African kingdoms in pre-colonial era.
Thank you. And Dr. Mbongi?
You see, the Trans-Saharan trade, this was a mercantile system or a trade system, if I may use a simpler concept, that connected the North and the South Africa across what we now call the Sahara. At the time, particularly in the ancient world, that place was not as dry as it is today. So the richness of West Africa led to this serious trade between the south of the Sahara and north of the Sahara, and connected people, and led to the rise of some of the most sophisticated political and commercial systems that we know of. You just mentioned the great Timbuktu, an area that has one of the oldest libraries known to humanity in the world. The story of Mansa Musa, I'm sure, is very well known, how he changed the prices of gold when he was moving from Mali to his pilgrimage in Mecca, you know, giving gold gifts on the way. One of the outstanding developments of the Great Zimbabwe is actually the building industry that developed at the time. Before the world will talk about the using of mortar and all that, the people of the Great Zimbabwe had known how to build buildings that last up to this time. And between the 11th and 15th century, we have remains of the buildings that exist up to now without using mortar the way we know it today. What that tells us is that these guys understood clearly the science of geometry, you know, the science of building and architecture and all that, long before we'll talk of any meaningful influence from outside.
Thank you very much for that. So now let's go to the audience. There is somebody here who has a question.
Hello, my name is Robert Otieno, a journalism student, and I have a question to Dr. Hojairi. And the question is in relation to these kingdoms and the civilization and colonization period. It goes, these kingdoms did not just exist in isolation. They used to do trade, construction, and also shaped the culture of how people used to behave by that time. So how do you think the influences show up in our current lives today? And also, do you think colonialism really ended in how our leadership is shaped nowadays?
Yeah, so in terms of colonialism actually ending, unfortunately not in terms of a full stop. The power relations and the economic relations, the unfair relations that were embedded in the colonial system are run very deep, and they're structural. And of course, you know, again, the global hegemon shifted from Europe to North America, but essentially is a part of, you know, Western culture. So in many ways, the relationship, the colonial relationships, have not really been completely erased. Now, they have been eroded in some areas have been more successful. But we are now, of course, entering a phase of, you know, a shift in global relations with great opportunities that, if, you know, utilized properly, you know, this could be great time for the entire continent. To address the other questions, when colonialism really, you know, sort of struck into the heart of the African continent, the colonial perspective of the world had already been constructed. The European sort of Eurocentric and racial hierarchy of humanity was already codified. So this was not actually simply a matter of addressing facts on the ground. It was actually about imposing facts forcing them on the African continent, but also in terms of trade relations, in terms of connections, in terms of networks. What colonialism actually aims at doing is to break any interconnections in a specific part of the world in favor of connections only from center to periphery, the center being the colonial metropole.
Okay, let's take another question from the floor.
My name is Marion Mwema, and I'm a third-year student journalist from the University of Nairobi. I am directing my question to Dr. Kenneth Ombogi. And the question is, some historians argue that Africa's civilizations were deliberately downplayed in global history books. So why do you think Africa's contributions to science, architecture, and governance haven't been given the recognition that they deserve?
This is basically because of the deliberate move, to dominate and control Africans. You cannot control people who understand their history well, people who understand what their identity is. So the first thing the colonizer does is to brainwash you, tell you that everything African is primitive. Change your name. My first name is purportedly Kenneth. So the reason why historians, particularly of the Eurocentric actually don't recognize the technological changes and the infrastructural and scientific development that happened in Africa in pre-colonial period is actually part of the larger colonial project of dominating, alienating, dominating, and controlling Africans. As late as the 1960s, one renowned historian from Oxford, Professor Trevor Roper, actually denied the existence of African history before colonialism. And he said, and I quote, "Perhaps in the future there will be African history to teach. What is there now is history of European explorers, European administrators, and European missionaries. And the rest is darkness. And darkness is not a subject of history." That was in the 60s.
Okay, I want to go to Ben, who's in Cape Town, to pick up on actually where we are right now. Because Ben, many ancient African societies, such as the Kingdom of Congo or the Ashanti Confederacy, had highly sophisticated political and legal systems. How did these indigenous governance models that often involved decentralized power or specialized councils or even matrilineal succession differ from European systems, for example? And what lessons in leadership can we draw from them today?
Thanks. I think, as you said correctly, at the time and even today, the European tradition is very patriarchal, meaning that they had a system where you could not inherit any form of wealth or land or property if you were a female. So that also then, obviously, when it came to our encountering African societies, where there is not a homogeneous, contrary to popular belief, there isn't a homogeneous system of governance or of patriarchal lineage in in Africa. You have a place such as in Limpopo, where you have the Queen Muchachi, who has a matriarchal system where her brothers marry women on her behalf, but she remains the head of that community or that particular group of people. So when they came to Africa, and then of course they imposed their system of political and social dominance upon us, we then obviously also had to adapt that while still maintaining some of our customs. So for example, whether you are in South Africa, whether you're in Northern Africa, West Africa, we have still maintained the system of lobola. I think some people call it a dowry. In there, I'm not sure what it's called in other places. So in terms of again the political system that we then obviously adopted and which we still use today, it remains extremely patriarchal. But then again, that's also because of the European dominance that we felt as a continent. So what we are teaching generations and what we've been taught ourselves has also reinforced why we remain colonized today.
All right. So we're going to go into a break right now, but we'll be right back and we will continue with this conversation about Africa's great ancient civilizations. Stay with us. Welcome back to our conversation focusing on ancient African civilizations. Now, before we took a break, Dr. Obongi mentioned something that I really think piqued my interest, and that was about this renowned historian who, in the 1960s, just completely rubbished African civilizations and our history and said that it didn't exist. Now, when I was doing research for this show, I kept seeing that a lot of this information we have today about these ancient civilizations is from the people, the outsiders who came to Africa and then told the stories to the outside world. Now, I want to talk about storytelling. And this first question will come to you, Dr. Hojairi, in Cairo. Oral tradition, the griots, and indigenous record keeping were crucial. And we know that African societies didn't really have written systems for their language families. Now, a lot of information for most of these civilizations was lost because there were no forms of written language. But in ancient Egypt and the Kush dynasty, they had their written language, the hieroglyphics as we know them today. How did they develop their own forms of written language while the others didn't?
Well, it's very important to address what you mentioned in terms of the way historical traditions were passed down. Throughout human history, oral traditions actually had been more important socially than written language. Of course, when we end up having the rise of city-states and later empires, that's where writing systems end up being crucial, initially for administrative reasons and record keeping. So that task was clearly more in the realm of the written language. But in the issue of the way, again, European academics addressed, let's call it the empire, the colonial world. Academia, was at the service of empire. So in many ways, academia was justifying the imperial endeavor and as well as facilitating it. So it was very important to, diminish any importance or break down the relations that upheld oral traditions and, as my colleague mentioned earlier, impose the colonial language on the native population. But again, when we look at the way things developed, first of all, for most of people, the oral tradition was the more important one socially. As for states and state structures and record keeping, obviously the written language was one of the most important inventions of humanity. And that invention shows us how humanity functions from cuneiform, at least as far as the evidence shows, developing in Mesopotamia and Southwest Asia, then the hieroglyphic script developing in the Nile Valley in East and Northeast Africa, and then of course the earliest forms of a phonetic alphabet developing in the Levant, which is a connection that kind of links Africa, Asia, and Europe.
How do we then, as modern historians and researchers, balance the archaeological evidence with the rich, complex, and often unwritten narratives of these cultures to form a complete picture of their past?
I think, well, number one, I think I agree with what my colleagues have said. Firstly, I just want to maybe take a back step as well, because what we interpret and how we understand communication is through writing, and that is through the English language. However, if you look at the Ndebele culture, if you look at the Zulu culture, the Xhosa culture, many other African cultures, they used to use beads and geometric shapes to communicate. There are those very famous Ndebele houses, which are painted in multiple colors with lots of geometric shapes. And those things communicate complex ideas. And it's not necessarily through the written word, it is done through those shapes, etc. And even hieroglyphics, for example, are not the written word, it is also the communication through iconography and pictures, images, etc. So there is a different form of communication that was being practiced in Africa and by certain African cultures. It's just that when we were again through the process of colonization and mass media, etc., writing in the English language with the alphabet as we know it has become the dominant form of communication in the world, for better or for worse. Now, as you've asked the question around how do we address this, there is a massive discourse in academia around decolonization. We talk about decolonization a lot, but we never really say what that means. And earlier on, we alluded to the fact that even in our understandings of anthropology, which is how African societies were being studied back then through European anthropology, that lens that was being used, that Eurocentric lens, has completely missed, I'd say 80%, maybe 90% of what we can consider to be African history. However, we are a people with a strong intangible presence. What I mean is our history is not just confined to brick and mortar structures, writing, etc. Our intangible cultural practices have remained throughout different societies.
All right, thank you very much for that. So let's now go to the audience just to hear some of the questions that we have. Yeah.
Well, I'm Joseph Kuria, a student at the University of Nairobi, pursuing journalism. And to Dr. Kenneth Ombogi, my question, now that we are talking about rediscovering Africa's civilization, and indeed we have been able to see that we had a rich civilization, how is it that we can bring this into the spotlight, especially through media and education for our younger generation to benefit? And how will it even be practical, applicable to our current context? Yes.
I'll take a clue from what my friend has said, that the best way, for example, to bring historical knowledge and authentic historical knowledge is to use multiple sources of information. Oral traditions alone are not enough. You see, archaeology is by itself not enough. The written word is not enough. But put together the spoken word, archaeology, and also the written word will give us a complete picture that will be more relevant to those of us who have partly been immersed into this situation of being brainwashed, particularly by overly Eurocentric epistemologies knowledge. The second one is actually being very deliberate in what we do as a people and as a continent by talking about ourselves and by deliberately being Afrocentric in the way we approach things and deal with things that are geared towards demeaning us and erasing our past. We need to deliberately correct that and demonstrate that when other areas were still struggling in the Stone Age era, Africa had actually moved on technologically. If you see the origins of, for example, the Hellenic civilization, the Greek civilization is what we call the Hellenic civilization, and the Roman Empire civilization, really. Much of that was the extension of Egypt.
All right, so let me give the opportunity again to an audience member.
My name is Whitney Lubidu. I'm a student at the University of Nairobi also. And some of the things I've picked up from the conversation is the colonizer. This is something Dr. Kenneth said. The colonizer's work is to eliminate the colonized by alienation, dehumanization, and to deny their identity. And now to Ben from South Africa. So he talked about a decentralized government system, about the difference between our systems and the European systems, and also talked about patriarchal and matriarchal families in their country, and also political and social dominance, where now people are still trying to erode it in the culture and few communities are still practicing things like dowry payments. So now the bigger question is, if Africa had not been colonized, what do you think the continent might have been or might have looked like in terms of civilization, innovation, education, and things of the sort?
I like that question, Ben.
Thank you. That's a very good question, and I really appreciate it. Now, the first thing I think is that when it comes to development, when we look at our continent, other areas of the world, South America, Australasia, Asia itself, etc., what we see is that when we talk, there was the question around westernization versus modernity, which was also a very good question. Now, the way that we interpret development, number one, is that we need to have highways, we need to have motor vehicles, we need to have sky risers, etc. Then we say a society has developed, and that is a Eurocentric or a Western perspective of development. The first question I ask is, before we were colonized, before European domination on the African continent, we had a high standard of living. There was no homelessness. There was no poverty. People had access to land. There were no informal structures. Everyone lived within a formal structure. The reason why we find ourselves in this state is because we have not managed to achieve by design what is now the Western form of development, which is the high rises, the sky rises, the highways, etc. And that is by design because, number one, they need to keep us in this state so that they can continue to exploit our resources cheaply. Otherwise, if we reach a level of development such as Southeast Asia or China, they have to pay a fair price for our resources, which is something that they don't want to do, which is the basis of all colonization and slavery in the first place. So I believe that had we continued on our trajectory, we would have continued to remain ecologically sound within our communities. We would have maintained the high levels of production in terms of food, economy, gold, resources, etc., that we were doing before contact with Europeans. And had we then maybe, again, because yes, we would have interacted with Europeans, yes, we would have interacted with people from Asia, yes, we were already interacting with those from the Middle East, those technologies would have flown into us, but not from a place where we were dominated, and those technologies were just utilized to extract our resources. And if that had not been the case, I do believe that we would have been a world leader.
All right, so I'm afraid we've run out of time. I'm told we need to wrap up now. And so I just need to come to each one of you for your final thoughts on this, even as we wrap up on this conversation. And Ben, let me just begin with you. What are your final thoughts, even as we wrap up this topic, Ben?
I think for me, these dialogues are important. This is obviously a drop in the bucket. We are trying to tackle many issues here at once in this conversation. We're trying to tackle the issue of colonization and neo-colonization, which is the state which we find ourselves today. And while we're doing that, we're also trying to address those issues that have stemmed from our history with Europe and let's say today, the United States of America, the erasure of our history. Now, the most important thing I want us to all maybe take from this conversation is that no one is coming to save us. These solutions to our problems will have to be basically done by us. It will take a lot of bold steps. It will take a lot of good and strong leadership. But I do believe that there is a solution to our current condition, and that solution has to be an African solution. Again, no one is coming to save us. We can only save ourselves. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Ben. Dr. Hojairi, coming to you, what are your final thoughts?
And my thoughts are that this conversation really needs to be happening everywhere. As a historian, I'm aware that academic historiography sometimes really never leaves campus. So this conversation is about something that matters to every single individual in Africa and the world, obviously, of achieving, progress that is actually for us, for the people. And in this regard, again, we need to have this conversation on a wide scale, not simply in academic circles, which again, today I'm thankful that we have this opportunity to reach a wider audience.
Professor Adisa, your final thoughts on this?
Okay, what we can do, and which already exists in many African countries, we have museums where the artifacts, some artifacts have been preserved. So, and new museums are being built. But the challenge here is that some of the artifacts stolen during colonial invasion need to be returned to the continent from Europe. So, and then there is need for United Nations to invest more on the preservation of some artifacts that have not been documented and then preserved, which can help us to write properly the pre-colonial history of the African continent.
Thank you. And Dr. Ombongi?
Thank you. Two parting shots. One, as a response to what the student from the University of Nairobi asked about how Africa could have been if there was no colonialism. Those of us who grew up in the village witnessed a bit of this. And I'll give you an example. I grew up in a fairly challenged environment materially. But when I had a wedding to attend or a ceremony, I never missed the shoes to wear. I never missed a nice dress, a nice shirt to wear. Not because I had them. It's because our kinship relations were so close that I could take lunch everywhere where lunchtime found me at that time. That is really what we call in Africa Ubuntu. I am because you are, and since you are, so I am. If I take you to the beginning, my definition of civilization in Afrocentric understanding is that you exist in harmony with the environment and also with others in very strong kinship relationship. A lot of Ubuntu could have been among ourselves if colonialism did not interrupt us. For those of us who grew up in the village had a taste of that. The second one is there is hope for Africa. They were here for 7 decades only, just 70 years, and today are more Anglophile than anybody else. You know the meaning of Anglophile? British oriented, really, than anybody else. I'm saying we need to deliberately begin to actually follow examples of the countries in Asia that have reimagined their existence without neo-colonial hegemony. And when you look at them, there is hope, and we need to have this conversation beyond the classroom as we have done before. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And that is all for this edition of Talk Africa. Next week, we will explore how to avoid clashes of civilizations and foster unity while preserving diversity in the modern era. A very big thank you to my guests, Dr. Mwanes Hojairi, Assistant Professor of History and International Relations. We have from Lagos, Professor Waziri Adisa, an Associate Professor of Sociology at the University of Lagos. Ben Mwasinga, Senior Manager, Heritage Conservation Management at South African Heritage Resources. And with me here in the studio, Dr. Kenneth Ombongi, an immediate former chair, Department of History and Archaeology at the University of Nairobi. Also a very special thank you to my audience, students from the University of Nairobi. Remember, you can be a part of this conversation online through our social media handles on Facebook and X. You can also catch the show on our YouTube playlist. Do keep the conversation going and join us again next week for more Talk Africa. From me, Penina Karibe, and the team here in Nairobi. Until next time, it's goodbye.